I want to go out. The first speaker into discussion is Mr. Shaw.
I am addressing myself to two facets from America. One involved in the remarks of Professor Rüstow and the other in the remarks of Dr. Leoni. My business is to circulate among the small businessmen of America. Am I heard all right at the back end? Loud enough? Yes. And I must report, very sadly, the average small businessman of America today is in a state which can be described only as being brainwashed. The older generation of self-made men are dying and retiring. Their places are being taken by men who do not recognize the deceptive terminology with which socialist forces are assailing them on all sides. They are, to put it briefly, sitting ducks for socialism. The extent and rapidity to which they can be unbrainwashed is a matter of conjecture. There is a long history of optimism, self-confidence, and self-sufficiency in America behind that attitude. I could sum it up, if I might, by picking a single phrase, the phrase with which the Lutheran Bishop of Sweden kept Khrushchev out of Sweden. It is a phrase, one part of which would be agreed upon by, let us say, the men who wrote the American Constitution, the great doctors of the early Catholic Church, by some American conservatives, and one part of it, mind you, by Khrushchev, Lenin, and Stalin. Now the remark, I will translate it colloquially. The remark that the Swedish bishop made was, if man will not be ruled by God, he will be ruled by tyrants. The average American businessman does not recognize the truth of that, nor does he realize the devoted confidence with which Mr. Khrushchev believes half of it. That is to say, that man will be ruled by tyrants and Mr. Khrushchev will be the tyrant. The average American small businessman has no conception of that. Turning now to Dr. Leoni's remarks on the tyranny of the legislature. We suffer in America today from an acute case of judicial tyranny. There are 23 separate headings under which 2 or more cases can be assembled representing matters in which the Supreme Court of the United States has in effect legislated for the country. I will give you only 3 of the 23. The first example occurred in 1941. And before I give you the parties to the case, let me quote the court's conclusion. And I will use the word the litigant instead of the name of the party. The court said, so long as the litigant pursues only its own selfish ends, its actions are not to be the subject of any judgment regarding the wisdom or unwisdom, the selfishness or unselfishness, the rightness or wrongness of the ends to which those actions are the means. Now, when a court whose duty it is to differentiate between right and wrong asserts that the difference does not exist as to a particular litigant, you have a very extreme case. The litigant in question was the labor movement of America. The next illustration I will give you is this. The choice of lawyers qualified to appear on the bar of the several states has always been under the final jurisdiction of the Supreme Court of the particular state. The United States Supreme Court arrogated to itself the power to decide who might practice law not before itself, but before the courts of the several states. The third illustration, the court had before it the question of the power of Congress to declare the communist conspiracy to be a criminal conspiracy. It did not deny the power of Congress so to declare, but it said, and the justice who wrote the opinion qualified his opinion with the phrase, "I admit that this is difficult to grasp." And what he said was, the point at which agitation for law-breaking becomes criminal is only after the law has been broken. And therefore, the party cannot be accused of intending to commit a criminal act until after it has been committed. In effect, the court said, a cobra is not dangerous until he strikes at you. If you are successful enough to dodge him and strong enough to appear in court, the court will then take judicial notice of the cobra. The whole set of these 23 examples, with which I could occupy a great deal more time, add up to this, that in America, the old Latin phrase, vox populi, vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God, has now had two phrases added to it by the Supreme Court. Namely, the voice of the court is the voice of the people, therefore the voice of the court is the voice of God.
Professor Heilperin.
Mr. Chairman, gentlemen, I would like to comment briefly on 2 points relating mostly to the very illuminating address we heard from Professor Erhard this morning. In the first place, I am extremely responsive to his concept of freedom combined with order. I think that's an extremely important concept and one which needs a great deal of philosophical elaboration and of practical elaboration in the further work of our society. Now, as a theme of today's session, I gather is the frontiers of freedom. And I think that those are also the frontiers of order, of the kind of order in which freedom prevails. And that is in economic terms the order defined by a market economy, by the freedom of individual choice and enterprise, and by a monetary order as well. Now this order, and there I cannot go along with Professor Rüstow, is today geographically a limited order. The frontiers of it, in the sense of the outward limit, are relatively narrow. They are, however, susceptible of expansion. And one of the great problems of the West, as we will discuss, I'm sure, on Friday, is how to organize that order within, and then how to expand the frontiers to include an increasing part of the surface. This is where we have the problem of the struggle between the two concepts of order, one based on freedom, the other based on tyranny and on the rule of force rather than the rule of law. Now I would like to suggest as my second comment that the concept of order based on freedom includes as a constituent part the notion of a monetary order. And I would like to suggest that the West as a whole, although it is moving in the direction of a monetary order, is quite removed from it. That in particular, I hope you will discuss that too on Friday, the Bretton Woods system is not an international monetary order, for reasons which I cannot expand on today for lack of time, but that it is capable of becoming one in the further course of events. I am struck by the fact that we have today, without any apparent conflict with the rules of the monetary fund, two countries which are certainly sinners against the order, against the concept of order in monetary affairs. One of them is mine, and the other is our host country, if Professor Erhard will forgive me for saying so. I think that it's easier to solve the problem of our host country, where a relatively simple measure is all that is required. It's a relatively more difficult matter to bring the United States within the orbit of an international monetary order, but what is required there is nothing more difficult than what France did at the end of 1958, or Spain in the course of last year, not to mention earlier instances, and therefore I think that too is feasible. Had we had an international monetary order for the past 5 or 6 years, neither case of basic disequilibrium in the balances of payments would have been allowed to occur. But since we don't have such an order, they have developed, and I think we stand a very real danger if the American situation isn't taken in hand very promptly after elections, that we may find a monetary disintegration develop in the next few years, which would be of extreme seriousness and of great potential danger to the cohesion of the West in the face of the Soviet and the communist threat. Thank you very much.
Dr. Veit.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it is quite a different remark I feel inclined to make, quite different to what we have heard at the beginning of this discussion. When I heard the speeches of this morning, it occurred to me that in common there is always the complaint, or let me say the regrettable fact that in the Western world there is so much propensity to ideals or to systems which really form the regime of the opposite camp. The complaint that in our old ideals or in the liberal attitude, the Western world is weakening permanently. I would even be inclined to say that that is a reason for a group like the Mont Pèlerin Society to work. That's what we have to work for, and that is what we have to work against. Now, I'm not satisfied in just stating that this regrettable fact is the fact, but I'm asking myself why. I've been working on this question why since long, and I've just tried to form my ideas in a rather long article, which I'm not going to read to you, but from which I may take just one point. It's going to be published in Ordo in the next issue. My thesis deals with man's reaction towards certain phenomena which have followed the developments of modern techniques. While the development of means of communication has reduced longest distances in the world to the reach of sight and hearing, while differences in language, in the ways of life, in nationalities, in other factors of separation have been bridged, an evolution with contrary effects can be observed in the sociological and the personal spheres. Man seems to be defending himself against the great melting, against the melting pot of techniques. He offers resistance to this melting in certain forms of cleavage. This has taken place in two ways, in the process of exterior and interior disruption. Both seem to be reactions, to my idea, to the melting effect of technical progress in the world. The exterior, you may call it a sociological effect, is a disruption which obviously becomes evident in special branches of science and techniques, differentiating more and more. Other symptoms of the sociological disruptions are to be seen in the separation of ideological groups, particularly that of East and West. So this is just the difference of a melting together. The other reaction of men is an interior one, and I feel inclined to see it, or to see it concentrated in the problem of freedom. Mind you, my point is that a cleavage, a disruption in the problem of freedom does not divide men and men, but it divides every man, that it goes through every man, that it is a phenomenon, an anthropological phenomenon, that human beings are, in the question of freedom, divided. Take, for instance, the statements, really horrible statements, of the Swiss author Max Picard, who shows possible results of disruption in his book Hitler within ourselves, Hitler in uns selbst. Picard's diagnosis of the Third Empire, of the Dritte Reich, has a central point in the interior incoherence of man in our time. Poems by Hölderlin in the SS man's valise, the works of Goethe in the guard room of a concentration camp, symbols of interior incoherence which may be the cause of horrible cruelties without any passion and without any sadism behind it. According to Picard, the complete lack of memory and conscience is another result of the interior incoherence within men in our time. The same source is responsible for various things. A thing which I myself have experienced was when the Allied troops entered this country, they were not simply lied to. When every German they met affirmed to have been an enemy of Hitler, while it is true that most of them devotedly fought for Hitler. They were not simply lied to, it was a disruption of man that the Allies met. We've not only experienced that in our time. I remember the year of the French Revolution. Taine, for instance, tells the story of the September atrocities, the September of 1792. Children were killed, old people, women, in a bestial manner, and chiefly not by the mob of the streets, but those cutthroats were most of them middle-class people of Paris, men and women who would lead a friendly, sociable, and unimportant life usually. I don't want to expand my point too far. It is just to mind everybody and to remind everybody who works on the problem why this situation is in front of us, that we have to go rather deep into anthropological problems, that it's no good just complaining that the thing is so this way or that way, but that we have to be aware of the difficulties in man himself. For instance, a dictator or a system of dictatorship could in one time have on its side a group of people, all of a nation, who a few hours later would turn to the other side and have forgotten that they were on the other side for some time ago. That is not untruth, that's how people are. This conclusion is far from being quietistic, of course. Showing the danger of men being shaky of the perils of tyranny must strengthen our will of a defense. I often feel reminded to a slogan in the United States, a slogan for which a man like Franklin Roosevelt had an ear. The simple slogan of "It cannot happen here. It cannot happen in the United States." Following my diagnosis of man, everything can happen everywhere and at any time.
Professor McCord, Wright.
I was a bit troubled by the implication in one or two places that there was some conflict between material welfare and the higher things, or artistic production. Now, it so happens that one of the reasons that I came to become a strong believer in capitalism was the study of the history of art. And therefore, I would like to present very briefly the reasons why I think that the artist, the scientist, and the businessman within a liberal framework are all tied together in one inseparable social pattern. It seems to me that the essence of art, great art, the essence of science, and the essence of economic growth comes through new patterns, the discovery of new patterns. The great artists are the artists who paint in a new way. The great scientists discover new patterns of relationship. The leading businessman discovers a new way of going at an economic problem. Now, new pattern does not spontaneously emerge. There has to be freedom for the individual to think and act if the new pattern is to be thought up and, more important, is to be implemented. I base my whole sociology on something I call the decline of the self-perpetuating non-competitive group. And where everything is so tightly held that there is no independent opportunity for the new man to come up outside the in-group, then you get a stultification of social life. And this stultification manifests itself simultaneously in art, in science, in economics. You can't freeze a society economically without freezing it culturally too. And as Whitehead said, Alfred North Whitehead, there is no such thing as the halting of society in the indefinite repetition of a perfected ideal. In other words, you can't go on painting Rembrandts, as we saw this afternoon, the beautiful Rembrandt, but you couldn't have a society that merely painted in that way indefinitely. Nor could you have a society that was vigorous culturally, that merely wrote in one style. Nor could you have a science, obviously, if it was merely repeating the same thing. Nor can you have economic growth without the new pattern which is constantly pushing back the law of diminishing returns. So the liberal order, which incidentally makes for comfort, in the sense that it does make possible economic growth, is also, in a far more important sense, the basis for continued cultural creativity. Now today, we hear a lot about the state providing us with a purpose in life. The trouble with the liberal order is that it makes these things possible for man, but it does not give them the personal commandment to act. I mean, it makes it possible for men to act and create, but it doesn't say, now you go and be enthusiastic about this. It leaves it to each of us to find our own imperatives and our own sources of inspiration. But today, people say there should be a national purpose. To me, that is a confession of an inner inadequacy in our society. I heard it discussed in a convention not long ago in America, that the state must give us something to be enthusiastic about. I said, can you imagine any earlier generation of Americans asking the government to tell them what they should be enthusiastic about? Did the New England abolitionists get their national purpose from the government? Did the founding fathers, did Jefferson, did any great man say, the government tells me that I should be interested in this or that? It is only when you have the other directed man, the man who is merely a crowd, the masked man, that the cry is for the state to give us a purpose. And so I think the decay starts there, when people no longer sure of themselves ask the state to give them the purpose in life that they're not able to supply on their own. And then when they lack that fundamental self-consciousness, self-confidence, then they become impatient of the liberal society which exposes them as well as permits them. It is, as John R. Common said, a liberty-exposure relationship. The liberal society exposes you to the hazards of change at the same time in which it makes change possible. Now, if you are so unsure that you are unwilling to risk the hazards of change, why then you go and say, let's stop all this and have a single, secure, centrally directed order. But I am sure that whatever is of greatest value in culture, in literature, in art, in science, is also inseparably linked with that economic diversity and plural competition, which is the essence of the liberal ideal.
Somebody still interested in addressing this audience? Yeah? Yeah. Oh, no, we have no more. No? We have only the speakers of this morning who delivered their papers and who want now to say something adding to it. Nobody else? Yes, please.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, since there's nobody wants to say something, seize my opportunity and say something in my own right. I've been listening rather carefully the papers of this morning, my friends Rüstow and Röpke, and it occurred to me that perhaps we could add to the metaphysical analysis of this whole affair something more, one more aspect, respectively two more aspects. The one is in the order of the intellectual and cultural development of the Western mind. It is a fact that the notion of freedom of the individual as we understand it today was not a notion of the classical Hellenic antiquity. It was the freedom of the polis which was in question, but not the freedom of the individual the way we understand it today. Nor in Rome, in the old Latin Republic, it was not the freedom of the individual citizen so much as the freedom of the nation itself. The question is, what happened that the notion of freedom suddenly appears in the center of our Western evolution? And I think that what occurred here is this, that the Judeo-Christian concept of man being created to the image of a personal God has been an event of tremendous importance. This new thing that occurs here is the dignity of man centered and rooted in the personality of God. That man was an animal endowed with freedom and will, Stoic philosophy could discover, but that man was created according to the image and similitude of a personal God was not discovered by Epictet or Posidonius or Chrysipp. I think we are in the general view of our problem now, we have to do in the Western world now with the fact that the notion of man as a free individual destined to live in three dimensions, in the dimension of the space and time, and in the dimension of the transcendence, that these things have to come together in our appreciation of man. That is, the destiny of man transcends time and nature, space and history. Well, what happened then in the further development was that the transcendent dimension was being wiped out or got lost. And man now had to find his destiny in time and space, in nature and history. And out of this situation there emerges then what we call the great modern social philosophies, the social philosophy of liberalism and of collectivism. And all others are only derivatives of these two. Now Rüstow and Röpke as well have shown that within these philosophies there's burning the notion of salvation, der Begriff des Heiles. And this notion of salvation is the remnant of what originally was founded in theology, in Judeo-Christian theology itself. It was no less a man than Joseph Pierre Proudhon, who in his Confession d'un Révolutionnaire of 1849 made observation that all fundamental concepts of the Western world, some way or other, are rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition and theology. Now we come to our problem now. We are faced with the fact that collectivism today has the notion of salvation with it, and bases the salvation, the process of salvation, on force, entirely discarding a notion of man as a free individual and ascribing the freedom now to the collectivity. You must observe here a very insidious process at work. The fact that the characteristica, the criteria of man as a person, as they have developed under the influence of classical antiquity, Roman law, a Judeo-Christian tradition, that these criteria of man as a person are gradually being absorbed by collectivities, with the consequence that finally the autocratic collectivity of a Khrushchev or Lenin, that they are the only persons that exist. All personal characteristica, dignities, values, and rights of individuals are absorbed in this total personality. And this is the process that has taken place. That's the one point. And of course, consequently, if this is so, then our fight is the re-establishment and the recovery of the dignity of each individual that wears the human face to his personal rights and personal freedoms. I suppose that we have missed great opportunities by failing to point out that what has been happening here is a process of disruption in our civilization process. It is a matter of, to my mind, unfathomable importance that Marx formed the laws of capitalist development towards collectivism out of the first phase of the capitalist evolution. Whereas we know today that these laws are no longer applicable in our time. The second point I want to make is this. There is a connection, an intrinsic one, between freedom and property. The Roman law did not recognize property in the hands of slaves, because the slave himself was mancipium, was property. The men were either free and then entitled to property, or not free, then not entitled to property. Then comes the Germanic laws with forms in between, half property, half freedom, and so on and so forth. In any case, during this medieval period, any change in the status of the free man responds at once in the status of his property rights. Then comes capitalism, the development of modern capitalism, and here there occurs now a thing of tremendous importance, in this, that a growing mass sector of the population is habitually and constitutionally devoid of property, whereas it gets increasingly all sorts of freedoms and democratic rights thrown at itself. That is the adventure of capitalism. There exists in this particular fact that the growing sector of the whole population is endowed with all the rights of free men, except that basic right to property. What we are trying to undo today, and from that aspect we might analyze our social politics and welfare operations, is this: to give a base to the freedom, an economic base to those freedoms that we have given to these masses. I suppose, ladies and gentlemen, there lies the tremendous danger in our time that in trying to give a base, an economic base, to the rights and freedoms so democratically spent all around, that we are overplaying our hands. And what Mr. Shaw said was a very telling example. He might have added that it was not so much the Supreme Court which caused this distorted type of legislation, of judiciary decisions. It was the uncertainty and the lack of clarity in the laws themselves. And the Supreme Court could only, or chose at least so, to draw this consequence by pointing out that to change the law was not up to the judiciary, but was up to the legislature. The legislature, in turn, is afraid to change the law and is afraid to pull the brakes against this development, because there's election every second year, respectively every 4 years for the president, and therefore legislature cannot act in protection of the basic freedoms of American citizens today. In final analysis, I would sum up by saying there is era of rationalism, which started so gleefully and so convincingly and promisingly, with its belief on man's reason, finds itself in a situation where that what is rational cannot be done anymore.
Mr. Dr. Kuehnelt-Leddihn.
I should like to comment on this. Is that possible?
Why don't you? Yes.
I should like to comment on your point.
These few words are rather in the form of a question, a contribution to the discussion as such. Because if I bear in mind what has been said this morning by Professors Rüstow and Professor Röpke, and also Professor Leoni, I have the impression there are these fausses idées claires, clear but false ideas of collectivism. Ideas also of a lower moral order because they appeal to the stomach, and also they try to get the people, the stomach of course, as the notion of a false security. And then finally, in addition to what Professor Briefs has said here now, the notion of collectivism, which is disjointed and has no intrinsic connection with the Judeo-Christian idea. Hence we see, as I have seen myself on the borderlands of China, the tremendous appeal of Marxist collectivism as an appeal to society which never has been through the Judeo-Christian tradition and is collectivistic by nature, has no evaluation of personality, and has the very strong appeal to the stomach. But now I'm coming with the two big questions. The question number one would be, because Professor Rüstow, if I remember well, has spoken of light builder, of archetypes even this morning. Can we get a positive, attractive idea, a positive archetype within the framework of a truly democratic society? And I understand the word democracy in purely in political equality and majority rule. Is this a framework of where the common man, is the common man the average man? This has no social implication. This is a purely statistical implication. Is he the man who would really sacrifice, bring sacrifices, not real sacrifices, imagined sacrifices, because we do all accept the superiority of a free economy? Isn't this danger number one? As a matter of fact, Professor Rüstow spoke about the democratic liberal ideas in one breath. Is not democracy and liberalism, liberty and equality, are these not rather opposites? Is there not an internal conflict? And so therefore is not a rather ideal form of government a truly mixed form of government? In other words, where the various branches of the government have different origins. One of them, of course, has to be democratic because there is no good government which does not take public opinion seriously into consideration, but without making public opinion the ultima ratio, the ultimate reason, the counting of the noses, the craving for security, the predominance of the stomach over the brain and over the heart. Is not the danger coming from this side in our Western society? I mean, these are the two questions. The question of a light build, of an archetype, of an ideal, because it's rather interesting to see people are convinced Democrats, and repeatedly, as it has been pointed out in the very last book by Winfried Martini, we do need an idea to oppose the East, and that this idea has to be a liberal, or if my American friends prefer, a libertarian idea. That, of course, is certain, we won't even discuss. An idea, and the second question, whether there's not an internal conflict between die begierlichen Massen, to use an expression by Jakob Burckhardt, between the truly liberal idea and how this problem could be solved without giving, of course, naturally, we are unable, I'm unable and you are unable, to give a patent answer to this rather complicated question.
Dr. Hahn.
I would like to make a few additional remarks to what Minister Erhard said this morning. I suppose we all agree with his general idea about restraint in freedom as a requisite of the functioning of a liberal society. However, I think in one instance,
Nein, nicht ins Mikrofon rein. Das ist nur für die Bandaufnahme. Er soll laut reden. Das ist kein Lautsprecher. Don't interfere in my organization.
However, I think that in one respect he did injustice to one group, namely to the group of the social partners. Now, I am not a social partner, I can assure you. However, I think that to accuse them under German conditions of abuse of freedom does them somewhat injustice. Injustice, especially if I start from the general standpoint which Minister Erhard is such an able proponent, namely from the conditions of the Marktwirtschaft, the soziale Marktwirtschaft. From this standpoint, abuse of liberty is present in the case something is done against the market rules. The question thus arises whether in the case of Germany, whereas the social partners are accused of pushing costs, wages and prices up, there is something done against the rules of the market. It is the question whether in Germany they have what one calls in the States a push cost inflation, or whether there is a demand pull inflation. As far as really monopolistic forces are able to pull up or to push up wages against the rule of the market, as far as this is the case, the accusations of a misuse of liberty are probably entirely correct. In the United States, as far as I am aware of it, it is push push inflation, which as a rule during the last decade has pushed up prices and is on in last analysis the reason for inflation. In Germany, I think the contrary can be proved. I think it is a pull demand inflation. Now, this is not only a theoretical distinction which I am trying to drive at. It is a very practical importance insofar as a means of moral suasion, or as one Minister Erhard calls himself, I think, Seelenmassage, can be applied and should be applied in the one case and not in the other. I think it is perfectly legitimate to massage the soul of trade unions in the United States. But I doubt whether the same thing is correct in Germany. And my conclusion is that Minister Erhard would be in the United States an even better Minister of Economy than he is in Germany. If we decide that in Germany we have a clear case of demand pull inflation, then he should not massage the social partners. Then he should massage the people who are responsible for the inflation. He should massage the managers of the Bundesbank. Now, knowing the theoretical background of Mr. Erhard, I have the strong suspicion that he is doing just that. But he is doing it, unfortunately, without success. The Bundesbank has, in the conflict of reevaluating the mark or reevaluating the price-cost structure, chosen the latter. They have chosen inflation. If this is the case, then it is no use accusing the social partners of a misuse of liberty. It is rather the case of accusing the Bundesbank and the monetary authorities of not being hard enough against those forces who prevent reasonable and, from as far as I know, almost all responsible economists accepted and acknowledged monetary policy.
Nobody else? Then Dr. Veit wants to add 2 minutes to what he said before.
I'm not sure whether I can do it in 2 minutes, but maybe in 3. The discussion has drifted in different and rather interesting directions. I do not want to comment on what has been said just now, but on a remark of Professor Briefs, which he started with. Professor Briefs referred to Christian thinking, to Christian philosophy, and to the integration of European culture by Christianity. His point was that freedom, if I understood him correctly, was not endangered as much as it is nowadays, in the time when this integration by Christianity was alive and was efficient. This statement certainly is correct. Anyway, I should like to point out that from the very beginning, in Christian thinking, in Christian tradition, and even in the gospel, the attitude towards freedom was ambivalent. It is not by chance that in the whole history of theology, nothing has been contested as much as the thesis of Christ that men are free and that men stand themselves directly before God. The antithesis always has had its force that man as a worthless and a human being, a very human being, is not enabled to be free, that he has not the freedom of will. The whole Reformation, from Calvin to Luther, was based on the thesis of denying the freedom of will. Eastern Christendom. I remind you, for instance, of the story in the Brother Karamazov of the Grand Inquisitor, is based on the idea that the present of freedom, the present of liberty, presented to men by Jesus Christ, was too much for them, and that a merciful new Savior, a new and a more merciful Savior, that is the Grand Inquisitor, should come to deliver men from freedom. This ambivalent situation within Christianity has from the very beginning laid the roots for the difficulty in which we are in these days.
Please, Mr. Shaw wants also to add something to what he said before.
Dr. Briefs, if I might, I would like to elaborate on your challenge that a root cause of our trouble in America with the Supreme Court was loose legislative drafting. To be sure, that was a contributory cause. But let me say that in the particular decision which I cited, where the court admitted the labor unions to full monopoly powers, the very same court 2 years before had asserted that Congress had never acted in that field. And Chief Justice Hughes, in that same decision, dissenting, said, "I doubt if any court has ever legislated so drastically in a field in which Congress has refused to act." The whole set of 23 items that I mentioned consist of what I think most of us would call, by any common sense meaning of the term, distortion of the language. And it had its basis in a statement which Chief Justice Hughes made publicly in an address in Indiana several years, I guess by now 4 or 5 years ago. He expressed the philosophy of the court, and he said, in effect, it is no longer incumbent upon the bench and bar to construe the law as it was written, but rather in accordance with the latest findings of the social sciences.
Now the reporters will give us their reaction to the discussion of the whole day. The first is Professor Leoni.
I think the case raised by Mr. Shaw about the difficulties we are confronted with, the sort of judiciary system, is a strong case. Undoubtedly, if we would shift the center, the gravity center of the lawmaking process again to the judiciary, we would be confronted with several difficulties. Any legal system has to preserve a sort of stability in the rules. And this is reached in a legal system centered on legislation through the rigidity of the rules. While in a judiciary system, this is achieved through the system of precedents. And of course, if you admit that you must have a system of precedents, you must admit that you must have a sort of supreme source of precedents. And if you admit that you must have a supreme source of precedents like a Supreme Court, then there is a danger, really, a danger that this Supreme Court could deviate into such a kind, into some kind of legislature. And this could be very dangerous, as the handful of people who would act as legislators are not even appointed by the people at large according to your system, for instance. But I don't think this is really a fundamental difficulty. I think that we could well contrive a system of checks and balances within the judiciary itself. Now you have in the States a system of checks and balances between the executive and legislature and the president and the executive, yes, the president, the legislature, and the courts. I think we could, you could also contrive a sort of checks and balances system within the judiciary. For instance, you have in England a different system. The House of Lords is the Supreme Court in England, but it is bound by its own precedents, while the Supreme Court in the States is not. Of course, there is a reason for that, because you have a constitution in your states, and so you have to interpret the Constitution, and so you have to admit that there may be a better interpretation of the Constitution. And then they say, why we don't adopt it? But anyway, the House of Lords in England is bound by its precedents, and you could apply the system too. You could imagine to apply the system to a Supreme Court, also in the States, I don't know. Another possibility would be to restrict, the omnipotence of a court like that, would be to require unanimity for any decision reversing the precedents. That could be another thing. Another system of checks and balances could be imagined by establishing that the lower courts should be free to accept the decisions of Supreme Court to a certain extent. And then you could have an idea of the failure of the lower courts, of what the lower courts think about the decisions of a Supreme Court. I think you could imagine several possibilities of checking the judiciary. But after all, I can take it for granted that you have difficulties in it. But the problem is whether you have to be more happy with these difficulties or with the difficulties arising from a system centered on legislation. There are at least 3 reasons why you could prefer a system centered on judiciary from the point of view of individual freedom. I would say one is that the judges never start a case. They have to be consulted by the parties. They have to be invited by the parties to judge and to issue a decision, while the legislatures can do that by themselves. They can start any possibility of changing the law. Another limit on the part of the judiciary, I think, is that any decision issued by judges must be enforced to a certain extent. I mean civil decisions, decisions in civil matters, must be enforced to a certain extent through the collaboration of the parties, or at least of one of the parties. And the third point is that any decision issued by the courts in general concern only the parties that apply to the court. If you take into consideration these 3 points, you can find in each of them a great limit to the omnipotence of the judiciary. Of course, you can say there is the Supreme Court, but we can check the Supreme Court too. I think we can restrict the Supreme Court. This is a very long argument. I can't discuss about that in a few minutes, but I think it would deserve a better consideration. And I dealt with these difficulties in my essay about that, and I think you will see it. Thank you.
The next one is Professor Röpke.
I'm not sure whether it isn't a rather bad sign for a speaker that his speech has not been attacked on any point. At any rate, I'm at liberty to choose now myself the point which I want to deal with in these few hours which are given to me. The first point is a problem which I think of the utmost importance, a point which has been mentioned, but to which I think not real justice has been done. It is the question of what the real ideal is. We have to defend, of which we have to be conscious, and by which we should win over those who incline towards communism or who have already become communists. I mentioned to you that I have come from this meeting with Hungarian students who had chosen freedom. And the main point first in our discussion was exactly this question. What do we stand for? And those people who had fought the revolution in Budapest and now had come to the West agreed with me on this point that for us it cannot be a question of racking our brains about any counter ideology we have to present, because that would mean to take a leave out of communism itself. No more or less hysterical narcotics for the matter, nothing of that sort. There's nothing which we have to invent. There's only something we have to remember. We have to remember the way we, people of the West, our ancestors have gone since 3,000 years. We have to analyze the components of this patrimony of the West. The two elements of our concept of liberty, the Greek ideal of the polis, of the free city, in contrast to arbitrary despotism of the Orient. Alexander the Great tried to impose the constitution of the polis in Asia Minor after his conquest. The poor people of the Orient had no use for this idea of the free city and the responsibility of the individual. Well, the other element is something which has been added to this rather by Christianity, by Stoicism, of course, and Christianity, the ideal of individual liberty, which has to limit, of course, this democratic ideal of self-government and majority rule. Otherwise, of course, we are heading towards disaster, and the final end may be totalitarian. I say, on this basis, there was quite agreement between those Hungarian students and myself. I developed this idea at greater length. I explained what Europe is, what the Occidental civilization really is today, the relationship between America and Europe, and finally the undeveloped countries. I want to reserve what I think is worthwhile to remember in this respect for the discussion on underdeveloped countries. And then the question the students asked at the end. I remember the first question was, what is the hope you give us? You have been so pessimistic. What is the hope you can give? My answer was, a Latin answer, a language understood by Hungarian students very well, because Latin, of course, has been the language of the old Hungarian parliament. Certum an, incertum quando, the old adage of Roman law, that the downfall of Bolshevism will happen, that the disintegration will set in, that is certain, but we don't know when. And it is unsafe to count upon an early date, and that would be to commit a mistake, which is very common, the premature optimism with regard to development in Russia, the premature optimism with regard to possible conflict between Moscow and Peking, and so on and so forth. The other question was, now let's assume that one day we can go back to Hungary. Let's assume that one day Eastern Germany will be free. Let's assume that Poland and the Baltic countries will be delivered. What then? And that is a most important question. And I didn't find it altogether very easy to answer this question. What is your program for that moment? And we cannot, of course, unfold the flag of Ricardo and Adam Smith to satisfy the curiosity of those men. I don't want to, I can't, I have not the time now to say what my answer was. What the main point of what I think should be our economic and social program for this day after, I can't develop this. Now, I think we should distinguish between agriculture and industry. In the case of agriculture, it is rather simple. That's to say, let us set up the principle of a re-establishment of the well-tested superior form of agriculture, superior in every way, and that is peasant farm. That is what Tito is doing. That is what in Poland and in Hungary has been done to some extent. Now, when they asked me, what is the hope for us? The question arose, how can we establish contact, exert influence on our own people who are under communist rule? How can we reach them? Well, my answer, of course, was not very hopeful. And there I had to say one thing with which I want to finish my few remarks. Unfortunately, it is one of the most indispensable principles for such a totalitarian regime to isolate itself absolutely against the outside world. The other day I came across a book written by a Russian economist, Leoni, at Moscow. It has been published 2 years ago. And it is a book on the bourgeois economics. Well, you guess, of course, what that is. That is what the Mont Pèlerin Society stands for. It is the social market economy which has become a subject with which Russian economists have to deal. And then this author said the social economy of Erhard, Eucken, Böhm, and Röpke, that were the names which were mentioned, is the surest way to condemn the German workers to misery and enslavement. Well, my first reaction was, of course, to ask myself, how is it possible that such a man can write that down? And the other question is, how is it possible to publish such a book and counting upon a public which will believe that? And there, of course, one part of the answer will be this absolute isolation. But very fortunately, in this Iron Curtain, there are some points which are not yet watertight. And one, the most important of these points, is Berlin. Therefore, of course, this cannot be tolerated, the communist thing, any longer. That's one of the main reasons why Khrushchev and all the communists, of course, regard Western Berlin, this window which lets in light, which, of course, is a hole in this curtain, how to get rid of that. It seems to me that our discussion is only at the beginning. It should extend really for days if you would do justice to this, and I can't think of anything more important than this for all of us. That is my final word today.
Herr Bundeswirtschaftsminister Dr. Erhard.
Herr Vorsitzender, meine Damen und Herren, ich möchte zuerst Antwort auf die Fragen von Kollegen Hahn geben. Aber ich befinde mich leider in einer etwas schwierigeren Position wie er, denn es ist nicht gut zumutbar, dass ich als amtierender Minister über Probleme deutscher Wirtschaftspolitik in der Öffentlichkeit spreche. Ich glaube allerdings, dass seine Analyse nicht ganz richtig oder mindestens nicht vollkommen ist. Die Wirkung von permanenten Zahlungsbilanzüberschüssen ist uns Nationalökonomen allen bekannt. Aber wo der Unterschied zwischen der Kosteninflation der Vereinigten Staaten und der Kosteninflation in Deutschland bestehen soll, weiß ich noch nicht einzusehen. Und ich glaube, das, was hier als Seelenmassage bezeichnet worden ist, tut dem deutschen Volk ganz gut. Denn das ist in seiner geistigen Struktur so geartet, dass es immer leicht in das Maßlose verfällt. Und das gilt eben auch für die Sozialpartner, aber ich habe sie gar nicht allein gemeint. Die standen stellvertretend sozusagen für alle Organisationen und Interessenvertretungen schlechthin. Wir unterhalten uns hier über Freiheit und die Ausdeutung dieses Begriffs. Ich gebe dem Kollegen Hahn natürlich recht, wenn er darauf verweist, dass eine gestörte intervalutare Ordnung, und ich bin geneigt, ihm diesen Tatbestand mit ihm zu bejahen, dass die natürlich zu einer Behinderung der Freizügigkeit zwischen den einzelnen Volkswirtschaften und im letzten Grund vielleicht auch zu der Freizügigkeit des einzelnen Menschen führt oder mindestens führen kann. Aber damit soll das genug sein. Ich möchte eigentlich mein Schlusswort in eine Fragestellung gleiten und sage, wie ist das geht, was ist das für ein merkwürdiges Phänomen, dass die einzelnen Menschen zu den verschiedenen Bereichen der Freiheit in ihrem menschlichen oder auch im gesellschaftlichen Sein eine so unterschiedliche Haltung einnehmen. Herr Professor Veit hat durchaus recht, wenn er sagt, die Spaltung und die Differenzierung in der Auffassung und der Reaktion geschieht nicht so sehr von Mensch zu Mensch, da wäre es nur zu verständlich, sondern diese Spaltung geht mitten durch unsere Brust. Jeder Mann in Deutschland würde selbstverständlich sagen, Gewissensfreiheit, das ist das Erste, was wir wollen. Die Gedanken sind bekanntlich auch frei, obwohl der Mut, sie auch laut auszusprechen, nicht immer gleich stark entwickelt ist. Und sicher, das deutsche Volk in seinem besonderen Schicksal wird den Wert der politischen Freiheit ganz oben anstellen. Aber wie kommt es denn eigentlich, dass, und zwar möchte ich glauben, in einer umgekehrten Korrelation mit dem wachsenden Wohlstand das Gefühl für den Wert der wirtschaftlichen und sozialen Freiheit immer mehr zu erschlaffen droht. Was geht hier in den Menschen eigentlich vor, dass sie sich nicht dessen bewusst sind, dass der Verlust der wirtschaftlichen und der sozialen Freiheit zu einer Hörigkeit führen muss, zu einer Hörigkeit gegenüber den Funktionären und ihren Organisationen, zu einer Hörigkeit im Letzten, aber auch gegenüber dem Staat. Wenn wir die wirtschaftliche Freiheit preisgeben und sozusagen nur, obwohl ich das ganz bestimmt nicht gering schätze, auf der freien Konsumwahl pochen, wenn wir also noch die Möglichkeit haben zu wählen zwischen Bier oder Schnaps und was anderem noch auch, das ist zu wenig an wirtschaftlicher Freiheit. Und ich glaube, das muss man den Menschen deutlich machen, das müssen sie wieder unter allen Umständen spüren. Auch ein gesellschaftspolitisches Phänomen erster Ordnung. Ich sehe natürlich ein, dass in der pluralistischen Gesellschaft die Organisationen gar nicht wegzudenken sind. Ich weiß nur nicht, ob sie ihre Funktion richtig erfüllen oder ob das Problem nicht auch einmal einer sorgfältigen Durchdenkung bedarf. Ich habe heute früh manche bittere Worte gesprochen und möchte aber jetzt sagen, ich glaube, der einzelne Mensch, das einzelne Individuum ist gar nicht so suspekt, dass es nur einer Kritik ausgesetzt sein sollte. Aber ich glaube, das, was die einzelnen Menschen fühlen und wollen, und die sind redlich genug, auch angesprochen zu werden und zu hören, hat kaum mehr etwas gemein mit dem, was dann aus den Organisationen heraustönt. Da finden die gröbsten Übersetzungsfehler statt, und weil die gehört werden, weil die Schlagzeilen der Presse bilden, weil das sozusagen die öffentliche Meinung, Rundfunk und Fernsehen formt, darum erscheint vor uns wahrscheinlich ein falsches, ein schlechteres Bild, als es der Wirklichkeit entspricht. Und deshalb ist es uns aufgegeben, den Weg wieder zu finden zu den Geistern, zu den Hirnen und zu den Herzen der Menschen. Denn ich glaube, hier ist noch die Substanz vorhanden, die unsere liberale Ordnung, die Freiheit retten kann. Sicher, wer die Freiheit verloren hat, der weiß genau, was Totalitarismus und Kollektivismus und Kommunismus bedeutet. Ob wir aber so sicher sind, zu entscheiden, ob und wie weit wir schon von dem kollektivistischen Gift infiziert sind, das wage ich füglich zu bestreiten. Und das ist mein Anliegen. Ich möchte also, wenn Sie wollen, von der rein wissenschaftlich abstrakten Synthese zurückkehren zu dem, was uns der Alltag zu lösen aufgibt. Und ich glaube, da hat die Wissenschaft über die reine Forschung und über die Verbreitung wissenschaftlicher Erkenntnisse die Aufgabe, sicher nicht auf die Straßen zu gehen, aber doch besorgt zu sein, die Menschen in ihrer Gesamtheit möglichst zu erfassen und möglichst anzusprechen. Wir sind meiner Ansicht nach gar nicht in einer so schlechten Position. Ich möchte zum Schluss etwas Versöhnliches sagen. Im übertragenen Sinne, in einer kühlen Übertragung, möchte ich sagen, das Einzige, vor dem sich der Rüstow bekreuzigt, das ist wohl der Ruf nach Freiheit, wenn er immer wieder tönt. Denn dieser Kraft, dieser sittlichen Kraft, kann er mit seinen Mitteln der Gewalt auf die Dauer nicht wirksam entgegentreten. Und den Mut sollten wir auch haben, auch dann, wenn wir zu Aggressoren gestempelt werden. Mir ist das jetzt passiert. Meine Damen und Herren, ich bin der letzte Aggressor und ich bin der letzte Revanchist und der letzte Nationalist. Denn ich habe es erfahren, in bitterster Weise, was das bedeutet und welches Unheil über die Menschen kommt. Und ich glaube, ich kenne auch die deutsche Seele gut genug, um immer wieder zu warnen und zu verhindern, dass wie auch unser äußeres und unser politisches Leben gestaltet sein mag, noch einmal eine Hybris aufkommt. Aber das hat damit gar nichts zu tun, dass wir den Mut und die Freiheit finden müssen, für die Freiheit einzustehen und immer wieder einzustehen und sie jeden Tag aufs Neue zu sagen und Sorge zu tragen, dass die einzelnen Menschen wirklich wissen, um was es geht. Der soziale Rechtsstaat ist sicher gut, aber ich habe manchmal den Eindruck, und nicht nur in Deutschland, dass der soziale Rechtsstaat bereits im Umbruch sich befindet in einem perfektionistischen Wohlfahrtsstaat, von dem ich sage, er ist dadurch gekennzeichnet, dass niemand mehr für sich selbst Sorge tragen will, sondern dass alles dem Staat überbürdet wird. Und selbstverständlich, wo bleibt denn dann die Freiheit? Hier wird der Staatsbürger mählich zum Untertan, ohne dass er es weiß, weil er nicht allein überhaupt nicht mehr existieren kann. Ja, in gewisser Hinsicht betrügen wir uns selbst, denn wir betreiben hier eine Politik einer Gesellschaft, die sich so an den eigenen Haaren hochhebt, wie der bekannte Mann. Denn der Staat kann nicht mehr geben, als er dem Staatsbürger nimmt. Und scherzhaft sage ich, das ist eine Gesellschaftsordnung, in der jeder die Hand in der Tasche des anderen hat und das geht reihum und jeder glaubt dabei zu gewinnen. Wir verteilen das Einkommen nicht einmal, sondern wir verteilen es nachträglich noch 10-mal um. Und wo soll da die Gerechtigkeit sein? Wo sind da die Maßstäbe zu finden, die den Einzelnen wirklich glücklich machen? Nein, ich glaube, das ist das sicherste Mittel, um Neid und Missgunst und Unzufriedenheit zu wecken. Ich bin ganz bestimmt nicht so geartet, dass ich Austerity predigen möchte. Das Gegenteil ist der Fall. Aber ich bin heute so weit, dass ich, wie ich schon heute Morgen gesagt habe, damit allein ist es nicht mehr getan. Die materiellen Probleme können wir lösen. Da ist mir und uns allen nicht bange. Aber wir stehen in einer geistig-seelischen Krise und an diese Wurzeln müssen wir herangehen. Und darum geht mein Ruf zu einer stärkeren Aktivität. Ich jedenfalls habe nicht die Absicht, als Liberaler in Schönheit zu sterben, so wie das Gesetz es befahl, sondern ich habe die Absicht zu kämpfen, dass die Freiheit ihren Weg findet in die Hirne und in die Herzen der Menschen.
Gentlemen, first of all, I think I'll have to give the answer to some of the comments made by Dr. Hahn. Of course, you will appreciate that I am in a somewhat difficult situation, actually in a more difficult situation than he is, and I can't really be expected as a Minister for Economic Affairs in office to comment upon problems of German economic policy here at a public meeting. However, I think I can say this. His analysis seems to me to be not quite right, or at least to be not quite complete. As an economist, I naturally appreciate that there is a certain disequilibrium or unbalance of payments in the interrelationship of currencies, but I don't think, can't quite see the basic differences between inflation in the United States and inflation in Germany. And I think the massaging of souls has done the German people, done them quite well. Actually, I think it's rather a question of the moral pattern, or rather of the German soul, and I'm afraid there is a certain tendency in it to lose every measure. That goes also for the social partners, but I didn't mean the social partners only. I didn't want to limit it to them at all. I rather chose them as a group representative for all sorts of other organization, pressure groups, lobbies, and everybody who is acting in the same or similar way. And what I'm trying to do, and what I think is very important, to explain to them, to people again and again, about freedom. And I think Dr. Hahn is also right that there is a certain disturbance in the interrelationship of currencies. I find no difficulty in agreeing with him there. I also agree that it will, in a way, hamper the free movement from one national economy to the other, and it might, in the last analysis, at least tend to also hampering free movement of human beings. However, we'll let that go for the moment. We'll go no deeper in it. What I was trying to deal with in this summing up is rather this question, which is intriguing me. What actually happens in human beings that they should place such different value on freedom depending on the field in which they have this freedom, and this freedom is exercised, if it is a social freedom or if it is a political freedom. And I think I find myself in agreement with Professor Veit when he says this process of disintegration, or process of disruption as he called it, is not a disruption between one human being and another, but it's rather a disruption inside the individual, and it's a splitting inside each human being and in his personality. If we think of Germany, we are quite sure, and we can ask anybody in Germany, we are sure to get the answer that the freedom of conscience comes first, and naturally we all set much store by it, that there must be freedom of thought. Although, if there is always the necessary amount of courage to take advantage of this freedom of thought is perhaps a different proposition, and the courage might not be quite so strong, but we'll let that pass anyway. The necessity of freedom of thought is generally recognized. Also, I'm quite sure with what the German people have experienced, they'll all agree that political freedom must be valued very highly indeed, and I'm sure it will rank very high on their scale of freedom, on the fields in which freedom is highly appreciated. But why then should there be, as it seems to me there is, a rather inverse relationship between growing prosperity and appreciation of economic and social freedom? What goes on in human beings that they can't seem to really understand, that with the loss of economic and social freedom, they will in some way become servants or bondsmen to functionaries and secretaries and all sorts of organization people, and ultimately also in the last analysis will become bondsmen to the state. And if they give up economic freedom, then, and this is not a thing to be underrated, they are giving up rather too much. I think it's not enough if we just limit our economic freedom to the freedom of choice for the consumer. That is, if we can decide if we have to have beer after dinner or schnapps. I think that is not enough economic freedom to be saved for us and to be retained for us. And I think this is what must be brought, must be impressed to people, that is what they must be made to realize, that all this is also a socio-political phenomenon. Naturally, I realize that we are living in a pluralistic society, and we cannot wish that all these organizations and groups were not there. They are there, and we have to reckon with them. But I am wondering sometimes if they are performing their functions as they should, and it would be appropriate, and I think perhaps this is a subject that requires some more thinking and some very thorough going into. This morning, I'm afraid I was a bit bitter in expressing myself, so I must add immediately that I believe that the individual is not as he is made out to be, and he is not so much exposed to criticism. I do believe, and I think that we can, what people want and what they actually feel, and what they, in honesty, will listen to, and what they would express if asked directly, is not exactly the same what is expressed by their organizations and pressure groups and functionaries. And I think the feeling of the people, the actual and undistorted feeling, is rather grossly misinterpreted and misrepresented by the organizations that represent certain groups. And unfortunately, it is the voice of these organizations and functionaries that find its ways into the headlines of the press, which is supposed to reflect public opinion, and over radio and over TV, and therefore it represents rather a less fortunate picture of the opinion of the people than people have deserved, and then corresponds to reality and to their real feeling. And that is why I think we must try to find their way to the minds and the hearts of people and of the nation, to make them feel, make them realize what we want them to realize in the way and with regard to the importance of freedom. And this is what imports tremendously if our liberal order and if our freedom is to be saved. Naturally, anybody who has lost freedom under a totalitarian regime is living under such a regime, under collectivism or communism, knows what freedom is. But I doubt if we can ascertain with just as much certainty the degree to which our own society and our own minds are already affected and infested with the totalitarian and the collectivist poison. And this is my great concern, to stop this advance and to meet this. And I think also it is a task for science to get away a little from the academic and abstracted world, and to move also into the day-to-day tasks. I do not mean, of course, that to go beyond pure research works and pure scientific teachings. I don't mean that the scientists should now move into the street and preach in the streets, but I do mean that perhaps men of science should also help to approach the people and to approach men and to the nation as such, in their groups, in their human groups, and to make them realize what is realized by the men of science themselves. Well, actually, to end on a more conciliatory note, I don't think the situation is quite so bad as one might sometimes feel. And I think I can be sure of one thing. The one thing that Khrushchev would shun as the devil shuns the sign of the cross is the repeated and undying call for freedom, because this is a moral force which he can't hold down with all compulsion of which he disposes. This is something which he can't hold down in a long run. Naturally, it takes courage to speak up for freedom, and we'll have to muster up that courage, even if we are branded as aggressors. I had some experience with it. I would be the last person to be proponent of an aggressive, revanchist or nationalist philosophy, because I have too bitterly felt how disastrous this is for a human being. But what I also know is, I think I know a thing or two about the German soul, and I think it's very important to keep warning and to keep avoiding certain things, and in particular to see that there is never again a hybris growing in the political life of the German nation. But it takes courage, and freedom must be expressed and propounded again and again from one day to another, because it's so important that human beings should understand what all this struggle is about and what are the things that really matter. I have no academic quarrel with the conception of the social state under the rule of law, the soziale Rechtsstaat. I think that's perfectly all right. But I'm wondering if not only in Germany, this soziale Rechtsstaat isn't about to being transformed more and more into a quite perfectionist welfare state where people do not stand up for themselves, but all responsibility for the vicissitudes of life is shifted on to the state. And I'm wondering what is left of freedom if all the self-responsibility goes out and all the responsibility is shifted onto the state. This is a process in which a citizen is being transformed into a subject, even without knowing it. And it is self-deceit if it isn't realized. It is if people think that this is the way to something good, something sound. It's very much like somebody who wants to pull himself out of a swamp by his own hair. Now, surely it should be realized that the state cannot give except it has taken first. And if this process of perfectionist welfarism is going on and on, then it will end up in a situation where everybody has his hand in another person's pockets, and where national income is redistributed not once but about 10 times. Now the question is, what happens to justice in that multiplied process, and where is to be the yardstick for this incessant redistribution? This is a process surely that can only stimulate envy and grudge and dissatisfaction. I am not inclined to preach austerity, but I think it's very important to note that this alone will not do. I think we can solve the material problems, but we have a very important moral crisis of the souls, and this is a thing where we must get at the roots. And that is why I am calling upon my friends for a greater activity in this fight. I do not intend to die in beauty as the law has ordained. I do intend to keep fighting for freedom, keep fighting to find a way to the brains and to the hearts of men.
What is left to me is to thank to the reporters and to the speakers. After 6 hours, almost 6 hours of discussions, and not to forget also to thank to our very efficient translator. Now Dr. Hunold has to make some announcements.
Ladies and gentlemen, just 2 remarks. First, in case members and guests who are lodging in the Hotel Reis and Hessenland have received letters addressed to the Schlosshotel Wilhelmshöhe, these letters will be in our secretariat. I mention this especially for another reason, because in this secretariat you have a book exhibition, and in case some of the members of the guests have not yet seen this exhibition, it costs a lot of money to bring the books here and expose it. In case some of you have not seen it, I may invite you to have a look at it. Second, we are going now every day to organize the panel for the next day.
all the speakers who will talk tomorrow have received the respective papers already weeks ago, because when we received the paper, the members of the panel received it, and I hope at least that they have read this. You see, we don't like to duplicate paper and people will not read. Now we are going to organize the panel of tomorrow, and I would like to ask the three chairmen of tomorrow and the speaker to stay here for 5 minutes, that we may discuss these problems. Say, the man who just arrived, one of the chairmen, is Mr. Haberler, Mr. Loveday, and Mr. Rüstow. These are the three chairmen. And then the speakers of tomorrow, quite a lot, Mr. Fertig, Mr. Wesemann, Mr. Hoff, Mr. Böhm, Mr. Schmulders, Mr. Kuehnelt-Leddihn, Mr. David McCord Wright, Mr. Ray, Mr. Navarro, and Daniel Wille. Thank you.